Hi! A couple of weeks ago I made a video on the basics of the Cubase chord track, which is a very useful feature in the production stage of a track. And in this video I want to dive into a bit more advanced and creative features of the chord track that make it even more useful. So let's go! Now in my first video on the chord track I showed you how to create a chord track in Cubase, how to put chords and edit chords on the chord track, and how you could control other tracks in your project, MIDI and audio, with the chords on your chord track. Now in that video I also assumed that you had chords to put on your chord track already, so that you either got them from a chord book, a lead sheet, from the internet somewhere, or maybe you wrote your own song complete with chords already. However, the chord track also has features that help you come up with those chords, and instead of directly controlling other tracks with those chords in the chord track, you can also use the chords in a more subtle way in Cubase. So that's what I want to tackle in this video. And let's start with the chord assistant. Because the chord assistant in Cubase is a tool that helps you to find chords in your project. Let's dive right into Cubase. So I have an empty project with a piano track on there, which has a contact instrument on there called the Grandeur, Concert Grand, and a chord track which is linked to that piano track so that anything I do on the chord track I hear through the piano track. Now to get to the chord assistant you first need to have a chord on your chord track, so let's put an empty chord on the chord track and let's double click that. Now you can use the chord assistant to also come up with the first chord, but it mostly helps you to find the next chord in your chord sequence. So let's just start with a basic chord first, and I'll try to make this chord sequence a bit more interesting than last time, which was very bog standard, but I'm still going to start with an A minor chord, but maybe a little bit more jazzy by making an A minor 7th. If I now create the next chord, I can go to my chord assistant in this tab over here. And by default you end up in the list section of the chord assistant. There's also proximity and circle of fifth, but let's start with list. Because this list tab allows you to create harmonic chord progressions based on harmonic rules that can be more or less complex. And the list which starts in green over here are Cubase suggestions for the next chord. If you want to first hear the previous chord and then the next chord, you can go back. Now, apart from the suggested chords over here, Cubase also shows you the common chord progressions in which the suggested chord is featured on the right here. If you move down, then the suggestions go into more red, and that basically means that these suggestions are less standard. So if you want to have a safe suggestion, you can stick with the green part, and if you want to be daring, then you can, for example, try something like this. Now there's quite a number of suggestions that Cubase comes up with now, and that's because we have the complexity at max. If you turn the complexity to 1, for example, you can see that the number of suggested chords is much less. Now these suggestions are based on standard cadences, because we now have selected the cadence mode, but we can also choose that we want suggestions based on common notes. So in that case, the suggested chords by Cubase are chosen based on the fact that they have a lot of notes in common with the previous chord, the A minor 7th. And on the right side, Cubase now tells you how many notes there are in common with the previous chord. However, if you're on cadence, then over here you can see which cadences Cubase comes up with. And by choosing a certain cadence, basically only chords with a specific harmonic function are suggested according to the manual of Cubase. But I have to say that I usually leave it set to all cadences, which provides the biggest range of suggestions. Now on the list page of the chord assistant there's one more little control over here, which is the gap mode. And this basically controls which chord on the chord track is used for the suggestions. Right now you see a little arrow to the left here, which means that the previous chord is used for the suggestions that Cubase makes. However, imagine that this chord is over here, and we have a new chord to choose over here. If we then open the chord assistant, you can also set this to gap mode. And the suggestions that Cubase comes up with now are determined by the previous and the next chord, so both by the A minor 7th and the C minor. But let's go back to the regular mode and get rid of that C minor 7. Now a different tool in the chord assistant that can help is on the proximity tab, and this shows the origin chord, the A minor 7, so the previous chord in the progression at the bottom, and it shows how near all the other chords are. And it basically shows the same list as is visible over here, but it shows them in a more graphic way, with B7 and E7 being the most obvious choices for the next chord, G minor 7 a bit further away, And again, D sharp diminished very far away. Now the last 3 chord suggestions that you tried are bold, so that you can sort of remember what you tried last. And if you hover over a certain chord, you can see that Cubase also suggests a certain chord progression with that chord in it, as well as your origin chord. And again, that's very similar to the list that Cubase provides over here in the list view. So basically the same information as in the list view, but just displayed in a slightly different way. If you're more visually oriented, then maybe you like this better. Now next up is another very visual view of chord suggestions based on the music theory of the circle of fifths. And I like this view quite a lot myself because it shows the function of the various chords in a certain key with these little Roman numerals. Now the circle of fifths shows the 12 major chords on the outer circle here, ordered in intervals of fifths, and the inner circle displays the corresponding parallel minor chords. Now with the chords that we selected so far, Cubase apparently thinks that we are in the key of C major, and that the minor chord that we started was actually the 6th chord. But if we want to see that differently, for example, maybe we want A minor to be the root chord, then we can switch over here to say that we're in a minor key. And now you can see here that A minor is taken as the 1 chord, and the Roman numerals are adapted to be relative to the key of A minor. However, let's go back to major. And let's say that we want to write something in the key of G major, then we can also make G the tonic chord by moving the circle of fifths, by pushing the arrow here. And you can now see that G is the 1 chord, and that means that A minor is the 2 chord that we started this chord sequence with. Now we're still selecting the 2nd chord over here, so we can choose other chords from the circle of fifths to do that chord selection. And I just showed you that you can rotate this circle. However, you can also right click on a chord, for example this A minor, and say use that as origin. And then you see it switched back to a minor key with A minor as the 1 chord. So with all of these chord tools in Cubase, let's try to actually come up with a chord progression of 8 bars, which is not too standard, a bit jazzy maybe. Let's see what comes up. But before I do that, if you like this video or find it useful, please give it a thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm. It really makes a difference. Subscribing to the channel also really helps. And if you want to get notified when I publish another video, you can push the little bell icon. Now, other ways to support the channel is by using the super thanks button below the video. Or if you plan on buying any musical gear, if you can find it at one of these stores over here. And if you first click the affiliate link in the description of those stores, I get a small percentage of your purchase without any extra cost to you. And you can buy anything at these stores. It doesn't have to be the article that I'm actually linking to in the description. So highly appreciate it. But let's come up with some nice and interesting chords. So we started with the A minor 7th and the next chord is still blank. And let's pull up the chord assistant. Maybe go to the circle of fifths. And since I started with a chord that's a bit more jazzy, a very common chord progression in jazz is a 2-5-1. So let's assume that this A minor 7 is the 2 chord of a 2-5-1 progression. And if A is the 2 chord, then the 1 chord must be G. So let's set this as the root, the origin chord of the key. So then our A minor 7 is the 2 chord. So we basically want to start our progression with 2, 5, 1. Yeah, but we're now on the 2nd chord of the progression, so that would be a D. Let's jazz it up a bit by going to the editor and making it a 7th chord as well, with a flat 9, which is even more jazzy. So now our progression sounds like this. Let's get our next chord, take the chord assistant. Well, after the 5 chord, we wanted to have a 1 chord, so let's choose the G over here. Or maybe even go to the proximity tool, see what Cubase suggests. Well, Cubase suggests a G minor 7, which is more in line with a jazzy chord progression. So let's make it a G minor 7. And to make it even more interesting, we can put another note in the bass. Maybe not the G note itself, but over here you can see that the chord also has a D. So let's put the D in the bass here. Move on to the next chord. Let's again see what the circle of fifths tells us. Maybe we can choose the parallel minor chord over here, E minor. But again, let's jazz it up a bit and let's make it an E minor 9. So now our progression sounds like this. Yeah, pretty nice. Let's create the next chord. Let's see what the chord assistant suggests. Let's just stay in the key. Let's make it a C chord. But again, more jazzy. So let's make it a C major 7th. And maybe even with a 6th in there. Next chord. Well, let's choose a bit of a weird chord this time. Still in the same key. For example, this F sharp diminished. And if we go to the editor, you can see that the F sharp diminished has an A in there. So let's put the A in the bass. Next chord. See what the proximity suggests. Okay, the F sharp diminished is quite far away from all others. So let's see what these chords are. I think I kind of like this A sus4, going from F sharp diminished to A sus4. Now this is the same root note as the previous chord though. So let's see if we can switch it up with root notes here. Okay, that sounds kind of nice. Next chord. And that's already the last chord in our sequence of 8 bars. Let's see what the circle of 5th can bring us for inspiration. I think I've used most of the diatonic chords already in this scale of G major, except for the B minor. So let's go for the B minor here. And to make it a bit less standard, let's put another note in the bass of the B minor. For example, over here you can see that the B minor chord has a D as a minor 3rd, so let's put that in the bass. So let's listen to our entire chord progression now. Well, it's definitely not a standard rock blues progression. I think it sounds quite interesting, quite jazzy, maybe also suitable for a bit of a soul vibe. So let's see what we can do with this. So let's see how we can now use this in Cubase with a bit more control than last time, when we basically just copied these chords to other tracks and then had them follow the chord track exactly. Let's first see what we can do with these chords on the MIDI part. So let's start by adding a jazzy instrument track. And let's choose a Scarby Mark 1. This is the sound. And let's put in a MIDI part over the whole length of this sequence. And let's open the key editor on this. Now we could now, of course, start adding MIDI events over here. But I want to show you how this can also be done with guidance of the chord track. And that's done by the scale assistant over here. And in this case, we want to use the scale assistant in the use chord track mode. And over here we can specify whether we want to use the scales of the chord track for this MIDI part, the chords of the chord track, or the chords and the scales of the chord track. Because if we go back to the chord track for a minute, you can see over here that we have chords. But because the chord track has been set to automatic scales, Cubase has also come up with a fitting scale to all of these chords, which is the A blues scale. Apparently that scale fits over all of these chords. So back to the key editor. If we now set that we want to see scale note guides, you can see over here that, and it's a bit difficult to see, but some rows over here are lighter than other ones. And the lighter rows are basically the pitches that are within the scale or the chord. Because if we now set this to chords only, for example, you can see that the light rows are different for each bar because we have a different chord. So the light rows suggest which of the notes are actually chord tones. So if we draw in a note over here, then we know that this G note is actually a chord tone. You can also set snap pitch editing, and that means that if you move this note, it will automatically snap to chord tones only. If you set this to chord and scales, then it will also snap to notes which are in the A blues scale. So in this way you can edit the whole MIDI part together which matches the chord and scale tones that are present in the chord track. Just in case you don't know very much theory, or even if you do know music theory, this can be quite handy. Now another nice feature over here is that you can also record a MIDI part and that you can automatically snap your played notes to what you've set over here. And for that you need to have recording enabled in the editor and actually be recording for this snapping to work. So let's see what happens because I have zero keyboard skills. It almost sounded like I knew what I was doing there, but maybe you noticed that even though I was switching keys sometimes, Cubase was still playing the same notes to stay within the chords or the scale. Now you can do a very similar thing on an audio track. Let's have a look at that. Because I have a vocal sample in my pool, so let's drag that into the project. And this is the vocal sample without the rest.
I want you, the same way that you want me to. And boy, I'm not lying, so tell me what to do.
Now if I play this with the current chords, it's not going to sound very good because it's actually in a different key.
I want you, the same way that you want me to. And boy, I'm not lying, so tell me what to do.
But if we now open the sample editor and turn on Very Audio Editing, now we also have a scale assistant here in the Very Audio Editor on the left, and we can set it to use a certain scale, but we now want it to use the chord track, and again we can set it to follow scales, chords, or chords and scales. We can show the note guides like in the MIDI editor, and we can also snap any pitch editing that we do to the pitches that are within the chords and scales in this case. Now another thing that can help is if over here you select the Very Audio segment colors. If you set this to scale chords, then you can see that certain notes are bright green, certain notes are a bit lighter green, and other notes are orange. Now the bright green notes are notes that are within the chords that are being played at that moment. The more pale green notes are notes that are in the scale, so that's A blues for the entire segment. And the orange notes are notes that are definitely outside of the chords and scales that are playing at that moment. So it's not actually too bad for a vocal line that's not even in the same key, but we can now edit this vocal line to be more in line with the chords and scales that are active at the moment. So let's do some editing here. So as you can see, these segments nicely snap to the chords and scales now. Maybe this one still. So let's see what it sounds like now.
I want you, the same way that you want me to. And boy, I'm not lying, so tell me what to do.
Not entirely convinced by this part here.
Did you want me?
Too many non-chord tones in this one as well. Let's see what it sounds like now.
I want you, the same way that you want me to. And boy, I'm not lying, so tell me what to do.
Okay, well I think that actually sounds quite fitting for this chord sequence. Now you do hear some tuning artifacts of course, it's not exactly natural. But that's just what you get when you do some more extreme pitch manipulation, and it's a sample, so it probably can sound a bit artificial. Now if you want to know a lot more about how to tune a vocal in Cubase, I have a separate video on that, which you can check out over here. Have a look, enjoy, and see you soon.